afternoon, Book Passage customers. Thank you so much for joining us for one of our online events. We are thrilled that you are spending your afternoon with us. We want to thank all our loyal supporters and customers out there. We really appreciate your business. And if this is the first time you are tuning in to us on our YouTube channel, well, thank you for joining us. We certainly hope that Book Passage will become a very important and good source of books for you in your life. So welcome to Book Passage and Conversations with Authors. I want to remind you that Book Passage has two locations. We have our store in Corte Madera. We also have our store in the San Francisco Ferry Building. And both stores are open 7 days a week for your browsing pleasure. So come on in and take a look around. You can buy your books that way. You can call us over the phone and we will answer the phone. Or you can even just order online, whatever works for you. We are happy to serve you. And if we have any business owners out there that are listening today, I want to remind you all that books, as we know, make the very best gifts for your staff and clients. And especially if you have, a hybrid situation with remote workers and in-person workers, books can really unify your staff. Book Passage has a very active business-to-business program. We call it our corporate buying program. We can offer you very generous discounts on books. We can often get signed books, and we can arrange for the author to do a Zoom call with your staff or clients. So if this interests you, then please just call one of our stores and say, I'm interested in the corporate program. We will be very happy to help you. Book Passage is proud to bring you our excellent programming, and please view our website for all our up-to-date events. I'm just going to mention a few that we have. We have a signing with world-renowned chef Alice Waters in our San Francisco store on Saturday, July 16th at 12 noon. Miss Waters will be releasing the paperback version of her New York Times best-selling book, We Are What We Eat. We hope you will join us. We also have famous and renowned researcher and author Michael Pollan here in our Corte Madera store on Saturday, July 30th at 1 p.m. And Michael will be discussing his latest work, This Is Your Mind on Plants. Tickets to this in-person event are still available. So please check out our calendar. It is on our website. We do not want you to miss any of the exciting events we have in person, online, and of course at offsite venues. So thank you. And here at Book Passage, our mission is to enrich, engage, and inspire. And Book Passage has been a Bay Area institution and a family-owned business for over 40 years. So again, thank you so much to all of our loyal supporters out there. We appreciate your business and we hope to continue serving you for another 40 years. Well, even if you are not well-versed in poetry, you have heard of John Keats, one of the greatest lyric poets of the English language. But what was John Keats the man like? Lucasta Miller's new book, A Brief Life in 9 Poems and 1 Epitaph, answers this question. Taking the poetry entwined with biography, Miller creates an insightful, vibrant portrait of the man. This lovely book is a great gift to yourself or to anyone who loves poetry but may not even know why. The author tells the story of the poem's creation with wonderful context from Keats' life, then takes the reader through a study of how the poem was received when it was first published. Dr. Lucasta Miller is a British critic and historian who has lectured widely on 19th century literature. Her influential afterlife study, The Bronte Myth, first published in 2001, was reissued in a new edition in 2020. Her pioneering biography of Female Byron was shortlisted for the NBCC Award in 2019. She worked as a profile writer for The Guardian and contributed to the Financial Times, the Daily Telegraph, and of course the BBC. A former visiting fellow at Lady Margaret Hall, Oxford, she is currently a Royal Literary Fund Fellow at the Courtauld Institute and reviews for The Spectator. And Lucasta is joined today by Adam Gopnik. And we are thrilled that he is here. He has been a friend of Book Passage for many years, and we enjoy selling his books. Adam is the author of 1,000 Small Sanities, which of course is available for sale at Book Passage. He is a staff writer at The New Yorker, where he has written for the magazine since 1986. Gopnik has 3 National Magazine Awards for essays, for criticism, and also a George Polk Award for magazine reporting. In March of 2013, Gopnik was awarded the Medal of Chevalier of the Order of Arts and Letters. What an honor. He is the author of numerous best-selling books, including Paris to the Moon, and he lives in New York City. We are absolutely thrilled he is joining us today. So it is my great honor and privilege to welcome to our Book Passage virtual stage 2 very talented and dynamic writers, Lucasta Miller and Adam Gopnik. Welcome.
Thank you, Cheryl. Thank you so much for those lovely words. Let me just give a quick shout out to Book Passage. I have spent the past 20 some years on the road in what we refer to in our family as the perpetual tuition tour. And there's no place that I would sooner go to in America than Book Passage. Truly one of the great, 2 of the great, because the branch in San Francisco in the Ferry Building is equally, not as expansive, equally dense with wonderful books. So Book Passage does God's good work of keeping the independent tradition alive. So bless my friends at Book Passage, and bless my friend Lucasta Miller, who is coming to us all the way from London. We're in strange triple time, Book Passage on Pacific time, me on New York time, Lucasta on London time, miracle of the 21st century. But we are all together on romantic time, because the subject of Lucasta's wonderful new book, Keats, A Brief Life and 9 Poems and 1 Epitaph, is indeed romantic time, the romantic time, the time at the end of the 18th, the beginning of the 19th century, when that cauldron of ideas and emotions and intuitions that we call romanticism were coming to life and were being refracted into the extraordinary personality and talent of John Keats, the subject of that book, of this new book. Lucasta, it's so good to see you again. I wanted to say that I thought it might be helpful to our viewers if we did a little bit of kind of foundational work first about Keats. It's a name I think everybody knows, but we may not know why we know his name. And then a little bit about the organizational qualities of your book, which are in a quiet way, quite radical, unlike any kind of conventional biography. So first, let's talk a bit about Keats. Why Keats? Keats writes in the beginning of the 19th century, yes, and has an extraordinarily short, if fertile, orbit in British literature.
That's right. He's born in 1795. As you say, he's one of the great English romantic poets. He's actually what we call the second generation romantics. It's Keats, Shelley and Byron who are of that generation. The older lot, Wordsworth and Coleridge, are middle-aged and staid by the time Keats and the others burst onto the scene. Yes, as you say, he leads this tragically short life. He's dead in 1821 at the age of 25. He dies of tuberculosis. And it's just extraordinary the amount of creative work he manages to fit into this very short life. Much of it in the course of a single year, 1819, this sort of annus mirabilis, in which he composed most of his most famous work.
And when he's at the age of 24,
yeah, I'm very bad at counting, but
my son Luke, who you know well, who's a philosophy student, and I were talking about it when we were playing baseball this morning, saying that Keats and Rimbaud are probably the 2 templates of romantic precocity that extends out to our own time. Luke was making the interesting comparison to Nick Drake, the great singer-songwriter who also blossomed early and young. So Keats has this extraordinary short and rich career, but instead of, you're a biographer, you've written biography, most recently of Letitia Landon, but you decided not to do a conventional biography of Keats, Lucasta. What kind of book did you write instead, and why did you choose to do this book?
Well, as it sort of says on the tin, it's Keats' A Brief Life in 9 poems and 1 epigraph. So each of the chapters begins with one of his poems, one of his best known poems, and the poem itself is printed at the beginning of the chapter. And then what the chapters do is to use the poem as a sort of entry point into telling his life story. So the book as a whole is broadly chronological, telling his story from birth to death. The final chapter obviously focused on his famous epitaph on his gravestone, "Here lies one whose name was writ in water." But I think the reason why I wanted to do that is that, of course, there are numerous incredibly impressive and very, very lengthy biographies of Keats that you can buy or get from the library. I wanted to do something a little bit shorter, a little bit punchier, and I wanted to put the writing first, because occasionally, I don't know if you find this, Adam, but sometimes with literary biography, the biographer's sort of, the quest for every detail of the subject's life becomes so all-encompassing that sometimes criticism of the work becomes, slightly, I don't want to say, second best, but it's not upfront in the way that I wanted to put it.
I'll say it, because it's been my experience of just about every literary biography I've read, with some note-telling exceptions in the last 10 years, is that they tend to get so immersed in the minutiae of somebody's contracts, resentments, friendships, rivalries, that we forget, or the author seems to forget, why we're reading the book, which is because we care about the quality of their line. And that's not something that's possible in this book, because, as you can see, the poetry confronts us at the beginning of every chapter. And one of the things that makes this book so delightful, Lucasta, if I may say, is it reminds you inescapably of what a great poet Keats is. Keats is one of those poets. The book opens with, "On first looking into Chapman's Homer," and the lines, "Much have I traveled in the realms of gold, in many goodly states and kingdoms seen," and on through, "Looking at each other in wild surmise upon a peak in Darien, stout Cortez," which I don't know if you know this, but Clive James used to tell the story. That's how they lost, what was that old British University challenge? Because you had to know that it wasn't Cortez actually on the peak.
Yes, it was Balboa.
Right. So my point is that these poems are so deeply embedded in the consciousness of anybody who's studied English literature or taken a class in romantic poetry, that a large part of your task, it seems to me, successfully completed, is to make them strange again, make them fresh again.
Absolutely, because these are poems that, so many of us have come across in anthologies. And in a sense, Keats has come to sort of symbolize the very idea of what we think of as being poetic. I wanted to recover quite how original these poems were when they were first published. I mean, their original audience, one of the critics said, I wish he could, stop being so concerned with his own originality. Why does he keep coining new words? I can't understand what he's saying. I also think that I wanted to slightly complicate our notion of Keats's voice. He's so associated with the idea of the beautiful, which I think in some ways has been rather sanitized, because for Keats, I think the idea of the beautiful also contained the ugly and the strange, and it's these strange tensions in his work that for me give it its creative energy, and that sometimes gets a little flattened out in the way we sort of, without going back and reading really closely, you can just assume, like with the famous poem Ode on a Grecian Urn, a late Victorian reader just talks about that poem as being about eternal beauty and eternal repose. Now, actually, if you go back to the text of the poem, it's full of these very sort of choppy, contradictory tones. It's very difficult to situate yourself inside it. He's actually making it hard for you to understand what's going on. And in that sense, he's developing a complex relationship with the reader. He's not just giving you the beautiful on a plate in a way that's, easy. It doesn't sort of slip down easy necessarily. He's making you think.
Yes, I'm always reading your book made me think of Degas' great remark, we do it beautifully so that they can do it pretty. Keats does it beautifully, and then other people take the Keatsian and do it pretty. And just to reiterate, we're saying one of the revelations for me, one of the reminders, thinking that I knew the poem, is that Ode on a Nightingale, again, one of the landmarks of English verse. As you point out to us, we never are sure if it's nighttime or daytime, and if there is actually a nightingale, or if it's only perched in the poet's mind. That's the level of purposeful ambiguity with which Keats works.
Yes, Keats is a master of paradox, of ambiguity, and also of these incredible, what his friend and fellow writer Leigh Hunt called his poetical concentrations, the way that he piles image on image on image, in a way that, I suppose, since the days of Shakespeare, Keats's great hero, no writer had been quite so daring in that way. To the point at which Byron, complained, well, I don't know, what does he mean, a beaker full of the warm south? But
it's what Byron was enjoying every night, even as he couldn't do it. But I think
exactly.
It's probably true. At the risk of making a grandiose pronouncement, it seems to me that Shakespeare, Keats, and Dickens are the three masters of lexical density in all of English, where each sentence is alive in a way that no one else is. But you mentioned Byron, and that leads me to another part of the book that fascinates me so much, which is its opening on not just social history, but political history. We don't think of Keats typically as a political poet in the way we think of Wordsworth or Byron or Shelley, but you show us that he is, and he's positioned within a particular politics. He's talking about Byron. He references Keats one point as Jack Keats or Ketch or whatever his names are. And indeed, as you explained to us, Keats was subject to a particular kind of snobbery that turned on the idea that he was a Cockney poet. What did people mean by that? Where were they placing him? What was the point of that kind of snobbish condescension?
Well, there are two aspects here. There's one, the political aspect, which is that Keats was on what we'd now call the left, and his critics and detractors were on the right. But they also used this sort of, class insults in order to attack him. So they would imply that he was vulgar, he was lower class, that he hadn't had a proper education. Cockney really meant somebody who came from the metropolis. It means a Londoner, not obviously the upper classes would spend the season in London, but then they go back to their country seats or whatever. So a Cockney is a sort of Londoner, born and bred. Doesn't necessarily mean, as it later came to mean, in
working class. It's not working. He didn't come from a working class family.
Working class, and it would be a mistake to. I think some people have tried to champion Keats as a working class poet. He's not quite working class. The nuances of class are quite, quite subtle. Keats wasn't poor. His grandfather owned a very successful business in the city of London. It was a livery stable. It's where, hiring out horses, and it also had a tap room on the premises. And Keats ended up inheriting enough money that he had a trust fund that enabled him to devote himself to poetry for a few years without having to earn his living. So we're not talking about somebody who comes from a dirt poor background. What the people who attacked him on class grounds were getting at was that Keats hadn't been to university and he hadn't learnt ancient Greek. Shelley and Byron, they go to these posh public schools, and to Oxford and Cambridge. So Byron
Shelley gets booted out for atheism from.
Yeah, Shelley gets booted out for atheism. But, Shelley and Keats have this quite sort of slightly touchy relationship with each other. I think Keats feels slightly condescended to by Shelley. Shelley's this sort of upper class anarchist. I mean, he, some of his poetry, The Mask of Anarchy, his poem, is one of the great political poems, in the English language, written from an incredibly radical perspective. But on the other hand, he was this incredibly entitled individual who was able to take on these very extreme political positions because of that entitlement, in my view. Keats comes from, Keats is not as extreme in many ways, but on the other hand, he is extremely politically engaged. But what is so interesting is that all the experiments he makes with poetry and with the English language, he sees in a political context. It's almost as if he feels he and Leigh Hunt and his circle feel that they're freeing the English language from its chains. They want to go back to the poetry of Shakespeare, of Spenser, and of, you mentioned at the beginning, his poem on first looking into Chapman's Homer, which is about the translation of Homer by George Chapman.
Contemporary of Shakespeare.
Contemporary of Shakespeare. And it's written in this incredibly gritty, embodied, visceral, physical language that Keats loves. He then gets mocked for only knowing Homer from Chapman and because he can't read it in the original Greek. But this is not because Keats was uneducated. It's because he, in fact, had an incredibly unusual and progressive education at a very interesting school.
And then trained, as I learned from your book, Lucasta, one had always known that he worked as an apothecary and then as a surgeon. I had always thought it was kind of Sunday work, that he wasn't fully invested in it. But you show us that just the opposite is the case, that he was actually a prize medical student.
He was. I mean, at the age of 14, he became apprenticed to an apothecary, which isn't just like a pharmacist. It's more like a local family doctor. But this was very boring for Keats. I think he was mainly made to sort of make pills and things. And then instead he leaves, but he doesn't give up altogether. At this stage, he goes off to Guy's Hospital in London and trains under one of the legendary surgeons of the era. And he's not, as people have sometimes thought, this sort of dreamy poet. He's always staring out of the window and not concentrating on his studies, as you say. He does incredibly well. He's promoted to a role which is basically assistant surgeon. At one point, he's manning the equivalent of the emergency room 24/7, 1 week in 4. And he's doing this at the same time as really reading and writing lots of poetry. I mean, he's not quite yet publishing, but the first poem that gets him noticed, the one about Chapman's Homer, is published when he's still working as a junior doctor. So I think he gives up medicine, not because he's bad at it, but because he loves poetry even more.
The missing ingredient, in a sense, in the cauldron of Keats' sensibility, his city background, his practical education, one way in a sense in which he does resemble his hero Shakespeare, who's socially positioned in a very similar way, not having gone to university and yet having a fine education of a more practical bent. One way in which I think Keats intuited Shakespeare's meanings better than anyone of his time or any other. But he also has like all of us, a mother and a father. I wonder, one of the most beautiful chapters in your book, Lucasta, has to do with the image of the forbidding or forbidden or woman. Would you read for us perhaps the poem La Belle Dame sans Merci that begins that chapter before we talk a little bit about some of its meanings, which were utterly revelatory for me?
I would love to read this poem. This is one of my favourite Keats poems. Shall I just plunge in and then we can talk about
yes, just to say that the title, it obviously means the beautiful woman without mercy, or in French more like without gratitude, without compassion. Anyway, but in that sense, and it dates to.
So we're going to now. Sorry, the date of this poem. It's in 1819.
1819.
And just to look out for, as I read it, Keats has this very, very complicated relationship with women that all go back to his mother, and we'll talk about that.
Great.
Later.
Forgive me. I'm just 1 second here, Lucasta. Our beautiful little dog, Butterscotch, joined me and decided to put down my ring light, the inescapable auxiliary assistant of every Zoom writer.
Well, I've
Lucasta Miller reading The Belle Dame sans Merci by John Keats.
That's right. Oh, what can ail thee, knight at arms, alone and palely loitering? The sedge has withered from the lake, and no birds sing. Oh, what can ail thee, knight at arms, so haggard and so woebegone? The squirrel's granary is full, and the harvest's done. I see a lily on thy brow, with anguish moist and fever dew, and on thy cheeks a fading rose fast withereth too. I met a lady in the meads, full beautiful, a fairy's child. Her hair was long, her foot was light, and her eyes were wild. I made a garland for her head, and bracelets too, and fragrant zone. She looked at me as she did love, and made sweet moan. I set her on my pacing steed, and nothing else saw all day long. For sidelong she would bend and sing a fairy's song. She found me roots of relish sweet, and honey wild and manna dew, and sure, in language strange, she said, I love thee true. She took me to her elfin grot, and there she wept and sighed full sore, and there I shut her wild, wild eyes with kisses for. And there she lulled me to sleep, and there I dreamed, woe betide, the latest dream I ever dreamt on the cold hillside. I saw pale kings and princes too, pale warriors, death pale were they all. They cried, La belle dame sans merci thee hath in thrall. I saw their starved lips in the gloam, with horrid warning gaped wide. And I awoke, and found me here on the cold hill's side. And this is why I sojourn here, alone, and palely loitering, though the sedges wither from the lake, and no birds sing.
It is such a great poem, Lucasta, and thank you for reading it so beautifully. It never stops holding me in its thrall, in part because, on the one hand, it's a piece of medievalism, which is an important part of the Romantic sensibility. It's kind of the pivot poem between Shakespeare and the pre-Raphaelites. It really turns consciousness in that direction, and yet it's never cloying, or it never feels artificial in that way. And every time I look at it again, I mean, it's no more fatuous cliche, I suppose, than that we find something new in great works of literature each time. And just as you were reading, it occurred to me those extraordinary lines, and there I shut her wild, wild eyes with kisses for. There's so much sublimated sexuality in the poem that I suddenly thought, oh, why with kisses for? Presumably maybe it's her eyes and her nipples that he's
this is one of Keats's utter masterpieces. His mastery of this ballad verse form is really, incomparable. And yet this poem, he just tosses it off in the middle of a long letter he writes to his brother who's emigrated to America. And he doesn't even bother to put it in his third and final collection. But interestingly, in the letter, the text of the poem appears, and then he says, why kisses for, you'll ask me? Well, why couldn't it have been 5 or 7? And he's just talking in an incredibly flippant way about what is, in fact, one of the great masterpieces of English literature. It's astonishing.
If you'll forgive me a student-y question, having made pedantic statements, I'll ask a student-y question. Why is it just suddenly occurred to me, why is it that La belle dame sans merci thee hath in thrall? Shouldn't it be hath thee in thrall? It suddenly occurred to me
Belle
that
dame sans merci thee hath in thrall. I think the sound of it works.
Yes,
and
no,
also La belle damsel Merci hath thee and La belle damsel Merci hath thee enthralled. Thee hath enthralled. I think apart from anything, it slightly adds to the aura of something slightly mysterious,
Yes,
slightly off,
yes,
changing the word
exactly.
order. Because that's the thing about this poem. In one sense, it's incredibly simple. It's not in one of those very, very complex verse forms that he is also a master at, as in his great odes. And yet he, as I said, he uses, so it's a simple narrative. There's no problem in understanding what's going on, and yet there are all these moments where he does something with words, with individual words, that sort of make you feel slightly ill at ease. He doesn't ever allow you to. So even in the in that extraordinary adverb, palely, I mean, oh, what can ail thee, knight at arms, alone and palely loitering? Now, just from the point of view of the sound, the way that ail thee and palely sort of echo each other, sort of binds it all together in this slightly sort of mesmerizing, hypnotic way. And then how can you palely loiter? Again, he's mixing a sort of colour word with an action. And again, that's sort of, and then just, palely, the putting an ly on the end of pale, you actually have to loiter over the word in order to pronounce it. So you're actually enacting this idea of loitering as you read it out loud. I think those elements, the way that he uses language very precisely to create this sense of unease, this reminds me a lot of The Rime of the Ancient Mariner by Samuel Taylor Coleridge, which is also written in this same verse form, ballad form. And interestingly, only about a week before Keats writes this, and it really pours out. The first draft is almost identical to the printed draft. What he does, interestingly, is one change he makes in the original draft. He wrote, I think he wrote, "I see death's lily on thy brow." And he obviously thought, that's too much, that's too obvious. I want to make it more uncertain. "I see a lily on thy brow."
So that's as you makes me think that you could write a nice essay about poems that appeared fully from the brow in letters. I think of Byron's "So We'll Go No More a Roving," which I think is also blossoms in a letter, and Larkin's "They Fuck You Up, Your Mom and Dad," which, if this be the verse, which is also just pours out.
I didn't know that. Yeah.
I'm pretty sure. But when a writer, a male writer, writes about being in thrall of a femme fatale, we know his mom is somewhere in the back of his mind. And one of the beautiful things about this book is, having introduced that poem, you then very tenderly and delicately related to Keats's relationship with his mother, which I knew nothing about, and replenishes the poem with still one more level of meaning. Tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, well, I mean, in the poem, obviously, it's a love poem, it's erotic, but on the other hand, La Belle Dame is this rather maternal figure. She feeds him, she lulls him to sleep, and then she abandons him. And this is really what happened to Keats when he was 8. There was first his father is killed in an accident, falling from his horse, and
so he never knows his father, really.
Well, he knows him up to the age of 8.
Right.
But at this point, the mother does not sort of hold Keats and his younger siblings close. She disappears. She runs off, in fact, with another man, and then reappears a couple of months later, married to this younger man, although she never again lives with her children. They all go and live with their grandparents. The mother, we get the impression that possibly even before this stage, she is slightly an absentee figure, or that Keats has incredible anxiety about being abandoned by his mother, even before this moment at the age of 8. I mean, he did tell one of his friends once that his sort of great tragedy was that from infancy he had no mother, as if he felt, abandoned by her even before then. And lots of biographers have speculated that she was already having a relationship with the man she ran off with even before her husband died. And then she's quite a chaotic person. She then, that marriage doesn't work out. She then ends up with another man who she's living with out of wedlock, and then that breaks up or must have done, because she then ends up going back to her own mother. And by this stage, she's an alcoholic, and she's dying of tuberculosis, the disease that will eventually kill Keats himself. And so Keats, aged 14, nurses his mother on her deathbed. He won't even allow anyone else to make her food. He reads to her. He actually behaves towards her as he describes, in a sense, La Belle Dame behaving towards the speaker in the poem, in this. And then, of course, she dies. So he has this very complex love-hate relationship with his mother. He both, adores her, doesn't want her to, thinks he can keep her alive by looking after her. In fact, it's the family doctor that he becomes apprenticed to after this, who must have seen Keats caring for his mother and concluded that, he had some aptitude for healing.
Yes. Well, it's so much the cold woman who claims his tenderness, and that's so much what the poem is about. So it struck me as totally credible that Keats mythologizes in the poem that ambivalent relationship with his mother, who is both essential to his well-being and profoundly cold to him.
Of course, but as you say, he is mythologizing, and all his portrayals of women in his poetry that are often, again, I wanted to recover how complicated and often even disturbing his portrayals of women can be. Again, I'm not saying this is about his real mother as a real person. I don't think we can, but they are about the imaginative version of the archetypal woman that he has in his mind that can go back to his.
Well, I think you do a beautiful job, Lucasta, if I may say, without mechanically saying this is a poem about his mother, throwing a light on it to say there's reason why Keats could write a poem that's both exquisitely tender about being in the thrall of the beautiful woman, of the Belle Dame, and at the same time frightened of the same emotion. That emotion is the most seductive one he knows, and also is the most chilling and paralyzing one he knows. It seems to me completely credible that the complexity of that emotion would be rooted in a relationship as complex as his.
Yes, and he does say to a friend at one point that he fears he hasn't got a right feeling towards women. And certainly, for example, in his poem The Eve of St. Agnes, it's really very problematic. This is another poem set in a sort of medieval context. It's about the idea of the Eve of St. Agnes, which was an old tradition where on St. Agnes Eve, if a young virgin performs the right rituals and goes to bed while she's asleep, she'll dream of her future husband or lover. In this poem, the heroine Madeline does all that. She goes to bed, she goes to sleep. But what she doesn't realise is that a real flesh and blood man has crept into the castle, crept into her bedroom, hidden, watched her undressing, her rich attire sinks rustling to her knees. So, he's a voyeur, and he's also quite portrayed in quite a predatory way. She goes to bed. She goes, and then he basically gets into bed with her, and although it's described in very sort of lush and metaphorical and euphemistic terms, he gets into bed with her, and they have this moment of sort of erotic consummation. But she isn't really awake at the time, so she is not able to give her consent, and this makes one feel really quite sort of uncomfortable. And it's not only today that we feel like, certainly in the era of Me Too, of course, we're going to feel uncomfortable about this. But Keats's own publisher felt more than uncomfortable about it. I mean, back in the early 19th century, he said, he writes to Keats saying, come on, Keats, I mean, you can't publish this. I mean, how does he describe it? That the hero, acts all the acts of a bona fide husband. I mean, that means basically has sexual intercourse, while she merely thinks she is playing the part of a wife in a dream.
Yes.
And, so even back then, it raised, all sorts of anxieties. And I think that often we tend to have an idea of 19th century readers and readers certainly as being very prudish compared to us. Like, we're all sort of liberated and, we can talk about stuff, and they were just, puritanical prudes. It's much more complicated than that. For a start, readers of that period were much, much more likely to be able to read sexual euphemisms than we are, because there just wasn't a literal language for describing sexual activity in the same way. I mean, even the slang. I mean, Keats's letters are full of bawdy slang, talking about with and about his male friendship group, who are all, very, sexually active with prostitutes, barmaids. One of his great friends has an illegitimate child. Keats himself catches a sexually transmitted disease. We're not talking about, the Keats.
Shelley's mistresses are constantly throwing themselves into the Thames and so on. Yes.
Well, the Keats that has come down to us is this very etherealized creature, this rather etiolated, spiritualized creature who almost doesn't have a body, and certainly is not a sort of sexually active or person. I mean, even in the relatively recent film Bright Star, which, it's incredibly beautiful, and it doesn't, it gets the chronology right. It's not sort of historically wrong in any particular way, but you could never imagine the character of Keats as played by Ben Whishaw as having caught syphilis.
No, which
just couldn't.
You can almost hear Robin Leach speaking, like saying, "It's the kinky Colonel Keats who is showing us." But since you mentioned Bright Star, and believe it or not, we have such a good time talking together. Time races. I don't want to miss the chance to talk a bit about both about Keats's one great love affair. He dies so young, he doesn't have chances for more, which is again exemplified, incarnated by that beautiful poem, Bright Star.
Yes.
Tell us a bit about that relationship, because you use the occasion of Bright Star. I should add too that the great odes, Ode to a Nightingale, Ode on a Grecian Urn, are discussed at length here. I wrote Ode on a New York Apartment. No, that was a word. I'm determined to keep doing that joke till I get a laugh on it. I told Martha, my wife, I'm going to keep doing that joke till you laugh.
Okay, Adam, you're going to have to show it to me later.
All right. But Bright Star, again, is one of those Keats poems that just kind of comes out like a song, doesn't it? And it's about a very particular and tender relationship in his life.
Yes, it's about his relationship with Fanny Brawne, who was the great love of his life. They did live next door to each other in
a young London girl from a slightly elevated social class.
No, exactly the same sort. Well, actually, possibly they had been slightly more elevated than his family earlier on, but by the time they meet, they're both, belong to there's this sort of metropolitan emerging middle classes. These are people who, they live in rented properties. They don't have, property
country houses or
as a form of security. Fanny Brawne lives with her widowed mother and her younger siblings, and the very first time they meet, they clearly have a bit of a flirtatious relationship. Interestingly, Keats is already involved at this moment with another rather more sophisticated woman called Mrs. Jones. We won't have time to talk about her, but you'll have to read the book to find out about Mrs. Jones, who he says he warmed with her and kissed her. Anyway, so
we've all been there with Mrs. Jones. They didn't put that.
Exactly. So Fanny Brawne is not actually the only woman in his life, but she does become the love of his life, and and she returns his love too. When they're separated, he writes this extraordinary series of love letters to her, incredibly intense, and yet, it's not this easygoing, happy relationship with the girl next door, which would have ended in marriage if only he hadn't become ill, which he does. I don't feel that Keats really ever at this stage of his life was actually wanting to sort of get married, have a family, live happily ever after. He's identifying with the Bohemians. He's identifying with the Shelleys and the Byrons. The problem is, though, that he really can't. I mean, Fanny comes from the sort of background where, you'd have to marry her, really, in order to consummate your relationship with her.
You
And
can't
then
run away with her to the Lake District of Italy to.
well, he says in one of the letters, what I really want is to run away with you to Switzerland. Now, we think of Switzerland as this sort of squeaky,
Squarest country, right?
Squarest country in Europe.
Right.
But at that stage, it's where Shelley and Byron had gone off on Lake Geneva with Mary,
Right.
Mary Shelley, who later married Shelley, but this is an elopement with two unmarried young girls in their teens,
And Byron
Mary
is
and Claire. So this is, but of course at this point Keats's health is beginning to decline. He's not only trained as a doctor, he's also nursed his own mother on her deathbed with tuberculosis. He's then nursed his younger brother Tom on his deathbed with tuberculosis.
And there's this extraordinary moment when he looks in his own handkerchief.
Yeah, I mean, when he has this pulmonary hemorrhage and he sees the blood, he calls it his death warrant.
This is arterial blood, he says, arterial blood.
So it's not just a sort of scratch on the throat.
Lucasta, I want to talk before we go, and we're running short of time, about the last epitaph, but let me open our conversation to some of our listeners as well, who have a couple of questions that I want to share with you. Stephen Thompson asks, at one point in the book, the critic Helen Vendler is likened by you to a Sibylline car mechanic. Care to elaborate? I took you to mean that she's brilliant in an oracular way at disassembling the inner workings of the poem.
Yes. She gets inside the sort of combustion engine of Keats's creativity and shows us how it works in the most incredible way. I mean, I find I'm so inspired by any critic who can take a great piece of poetry and actually show us its constituent parts and explain why it is that it has that effect on us. So I'd say that her type of formalist criticism, her capacity to look at the form and the, in the most detailed way at the component parts of a poem and show us how they work, I find that incredibly inspiring, and
is complementary to the kind of contextual criticism that you're doing.
Yes, what I'm sort of trying to do is to do a little bit of that, of that sort of
close reading, right?
Close reading, but to put it in the wider context, not only of Keats's life story, but of the wider cultural, political, era that he was living in. So, what I tried to do with the book is to try and, as fluidly as possible, interweave those different aspects. And I was hoping that from the reader's point of view, it made for a read that was quite there was enough variety. So I'd be forcing you to look in incredibly close detail at the use of a single word, and then you could sort of coast a bit while I was telling you sort of a bit about the history of surgery in early 19th century England, and then or whatever.
Well, all of those things happen in this book. You feel that you're in the hands of a real lover of literature, not of somebody who's turning literature into a game of poets and dupons and social history. But at the same time, you feel that for the first time you understand Keats as a full human being rather than as a kind of disembodied poetic head. We should talk before we go, Lucasta, just a bit about the very moving last chapter in this book, which is about one of the most famous epitaphs in English. Keats goes off to Rome basically to die. His last lodgings are still a shrine, a museum at the foot of the Spanish Steps in Rome to Keats. And he tells a friend that he once written on his tombstone, it's a kind of defiant, heartbroken claim, here lies one whose name was writ in water. And they do it.
Yes, I mean, it's really astonishing that Keats's gravestone literally does not have his name on it. And at the time he was dying, he asked his friend who was with him, Joseph Seven, if he could have this as his epitaph. Here lies one whose name was writ in water, as if he's just going to disappear, dissolve. Now, exactly how he felt about those words when he came up with them, it's difficult to say, because his friend says that actually after dictating this to him, Keats slept much more easily, he was calmer. So maybe there was some idea of just sort of, you know, like in the Ode to a Nightingale, just sort of dissolving. On the other hand, his friends interpreted it after he died as, you know, that Keats had been sort of wiped out by his critics, that he'd been killed by his critics, and they actually inscribed on the tombstone, that they put it in this context. They said that a young poet who on his deathbed, in the bitterness of his heart, at the malicious power of his enemies, desired these words to be engraven on his tombstone. Now,
So
in fact, it's a bit more complicated than that. Keats certainly was not, in my view, killed by his critics, even though that was the myth his friends took up. He was killed by tuberculosis. And at an earlier stage in his life, even after he'd just received one of the worst reviews, which called his poetry drivelling idiocy, and mocked him, he actually quietly said in a letter to his brother, "I believe I shall be among the English poets after my death." And I think we have to remember that too. And he was right.
Yeah, I've got that. That same reviewer wrote about one of my books. I got the driveling idiot quote as well. But just to underline, one of the beautiful things about that last chapter, as it's right through the book, is we're made acutely aware of these beautiful ambivalences and ambiguities in Keats's poetry and in his life. On the one hand, the readiness is all, he was died at peace. On the other hand, he was the victim, conscious victim of a particular kind of prejudice. We come away with Keats as a human being in Lucasta Miller's Keats, A Brief Life, in 9 poems and 1 epitaph, as well as an icon of English literature. Lucasta, thank you so much for this book. And Cheryl, thank you for having us here at Book Passage.
Lucasta, Adam, what a wonderful hour. Thank you so much. And Lucasta, you're just, this book is fabulous. And you've just kind of given us a little taste of it. I can't wait to read the whole thing. Everybody, this is the book. It is available for sale at Book Passage. We also have Adam's book, 1,000 Small Sanities. That is also available at Book Passage. Again, we thank you for joining us. Please buy your books here at an independent bookstore. You know, we are so thrilled to be able to bring you this free programming, and we want to continue to do so. And how we do it is when you purchase your books through us. So again, thank you so much for viewing. Look at our website, and we love having these 2 amazing authors with us. Adam, Lucasta, thank you again. Buy the book.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.